important election ever. Maybe this isn't the most important thing we're ever going to decide on. Maybe the fate of the free world does not depend on who wins this election, because they all say the same thing. Did you know that if Trump doesn't win this election, why, we're going to become a socialist country? And did you know that if Biden doesn't win this election, Trump is just going to become dictator for life and take away your Social Security and your Obamacare? Folks, none of that's going to happen. But if you mention that, people freak out. Because in the opinion of many, and they've been told this by those in the traditional media sources, and they've believed it, in the opinion of many, this election is akin to a very important episode of Blossom. Sure, it's important. It is important. But it's not as important as everybody puts it out to be, especially those on the right and especially those on the left, especially those who want you to drink their Kool-Aid. Now, am I saying don't vote? No. Am I saying it's not important to vote? No. In fact, here's what I'm going to say, and this is controversial as well. And those of you who are regular listeners to the show have heard me say this before. Yes, sure, you should vote for your candidates, but only if you have done your research, only if you have done your due diligence, only if you have discussed this with your peers and those who maybe aren't your peers, only if you've read a lot of different sources on these topics. And by the way, looking at headlines on Facebook does not count. That is not research. Just stay home if you don't do your research. If you have not done your due diligence on this election, just stay home. Have I been canceled yet? Maybe so. Because I'm telling people don't vote. And I'm telling you don't vote if you haven't done your research. I'm not saying don't vote if you're not pro-Trump. I'm not saying don't vote if you're not pro-Biden. I'm not saying any of that. But if you haven't done your research, if you've done your research and you've decided, you know what, I've vetted this topic long enough, I'm going to vote for fill in the blank. Congratulations. That's what you should do. But if you don't do the research, do everybody a favor and just stay home, because all you're doing is hurting the whole system because you haven't done your due diligence. Now, why am I leading into all this? Because if you remove the clutter, if you think clearly, you can make life decisions based on your chosen path, and you will succeed. Regardless as to who wins the World Series, regardless as to who wins the NBA playoffs, regardless as to who wins in the upcoming elections. And I'm going to repeat that. If you remove the clutter, if you think clearly, if you make life decisions based on your chosen path, you will succeed no matter who wins this election. Why? Well, you live in America. It's kind of simple. It's kind of basic. You live here, okay? And you can make any decisions that you want to. You can. You don't live in China where Xi tells you how to think or he throws you in prison. That's the rule, not the exception in America. Now, how do you clear the clutter? Just like a computer, because our brains are kind of like computers, folks. You just reboot, like I said before. If you're running your computer, or you're running your phone, and it just doesn't work, if it's just too slow, if it's just not responding, if it's just not giving you the results that you're used to, you turn it off, you wait, and you turn it back on. And that, my friends, that, dear listeners, is how you reboot your brain as well. And how is with that? How do you do that? Those of you who are listeners to the show know that. It's done by living the adventure of a lifetime 3 times a year. Now, I just completed number 2, okay? So, and I may or may not get to number 3 with this dopey pandemic going on, but I've done 2. I should have done 3, but the first one we had to call off. The trophy wife and I were going to go to Florida for a week and watch spring training, okay? We were going to drive almost to Miami. watch baseball, and then drive back. But we had to cancel because of the pandemic. They canceled spring training. So we pulled the plug on that. But we did do the family vacation on Lake Michigan. That was the adventure of a lifetime. And I've had the camping trip to Death Valley. That was the adventure of a lifetime. I've done it twice so far, okay? I spent a week off the grid just now, and I'm still coming off of that. Now, again, my adventure of a lifetime may not be your adventure of a lifetime. Case in point, there were about 10 other people who were camping out there that week. None of them stayed the whole time. They were coming and going. That includes all 10, okay? So if Death Valley is the thing that I'm saying, you have to camp in Death Valley to recharge your battery, only 10 people did that last week. So that's not really, it's not necessary that you do that. But it was for me. And for me, it was going into the middle of nowhere. I camped in a tent. I brought my Pelican cooler along, fill it with ice, fill it with food, fill it with supplies. No phone. No true phone, really. I did use my phone, but I used my phone to record my steps to see how far I've walked. And also, I need the timer on my phone because my percolator coffee at camp needs to cook for exactly 4 minutes. That's the two things I use my phone for. Not to talk to anybody, not to text, not to do social media, none of that. Part of while I'm camping, this time of year, sun goes down about 7:15, okay? Doesn't come up till almost 6:30. So I was in the tent for 10 hours a day. Now, did I sleep the whole time? Not the whole time, but a lot of it, I either slept or I rested. I'd sleep down, hunker down in my warm sleeping bag, and I brought along my fancy-dancy Sea Crane radio where I could go ahead and DX KFI, 640 AM, a 50,000-watt station out of Southern California, and I listened to that thing fade in and out all night long, listening to Coast to Coast and Tim Conway Jr. show and Bill Handel, et cetera, et cetera. So I slept and I rested 10 hours a day. 10 hours a day, folks. When's the last time you did that for a week? It was wonderful. I hiked Wild Rose Peak again. Wild Rose Peak is in the Panamint Mountains in Death Valley. The peak is a little over 9,000 feet, 2,200 feet of elevation gain. It's a 8.4-mile hike, and it was tons of fun. Wears you out at the end of the day. It's you do that, and you're not going to have trouble spending 10 hours a night in the tent. Trust me. I visited the Ballarat Ghost Town. That's between the towns of Panamint Springs and Trona, off of the Panamint-Trona Highway. Okay, and there's a guy down there I visited for years named Rocky. Him and his father George used to live there, but Rocky was not there anymore. The folks who own the town of Ballarat, yeah, it's owned by a people now because it's an abandoned ghost town, but they use it for something. I'm not sure what. But Rocky was gone. Him and the owners had a disagreement. A new guy named Louie is now the caretaker. Louie was not as friendly or as as forthcoming as Rocky. He really didn't want to talk to people. He didn't trust strangers, and I'm certainly a stranger. Every time I try to start a conversation with Louie, he was very guarded with his answers, I guess I'll just say. For example, I asked him, I said, hey, would you like to do a podcast? He said, I don't do podcasts. I said, well, why not? Well, I don't have a computer. I said, well, just because you're not going to listen doesn't mean it can't be entertaining. Nope, don't do podcasts, don't trust them. Okay, so you're not going to do a podcast with me. That's fine. How about lights in the sky? Have you seen things out here? He says, yes, I have. I said, like what? He said, I'm not going to tell you. I said, well, why wouldn't you tell me that? He said, you want to see lights in the sky? You come out here yourself and look at them. Okay, the guy wasn't going to be forthcoming, but he was probably about 50 years old and lived his whole life in the desert, in the middle of nowhere, off the grid. So you're going to have an individual that's a little bit different than most, maybe an individual that isn't very trusting of others. That's why he's living out there to begin with, right? But it was still a good visit, and I enjoyed the Ballarat Ghost Town. I did do a podcast. It was podcast 190, It was at the Panama Springs Resort with one of the owners, Ben Castle. It's a good podcast. If you get a chance, listen to it. It's podcast 190, the one that we did just before this one. It talks about how you can operate a business off the grid. It's challenging in normal times, and it's challenging with a capital C in these times during the pandemic. But and Ben does talk about things that he's seen in the sky. So listen to the podcast if you get a chance. It's a good one. But we did that and visited with Ben and had a good time. Went to Rainbow Canyon, Star Wars Canyon, some call it. It's at the Father Crowley Overlook, and it's where jets come down through, and they screen through that canyon with training exercises. They've done it for years. They've done it since before the days of the Air Force. They did it when there was the Army Air Corps, I want to say they called it. And there's pictures of bi-wing airplanes flying through that canyon, okay? So that's how long the military has been flying through that canyon on training missions. They flew with bi-wing airplanes. Well, I went down there with another couple that I met at camp, but something I didn't know is that in April of 2019, one of the F-18s crashed, and it just blew up in Rainbow Canyon. And I had asked Ben Castle during the podcast, said, did you hear the crash? He said, no, I didn't hear it because it was like two valleys over and the sound doesn't really carry. He said, but we knew something had happened because we saw the mushroom cloud. So that's how big the explosion was. Now, maybe I shouldn't be saying this, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. I scampered down Rainbow Canyon and looked at the crash site. And even though it's been cleaned up by the government, they took away everything that they could. Folks, there are millions of pieces of this airplane still littered about in the bottom of that canyon. And I brought a handful of them back with me. Maybe I shouldn't have, maybe I didn't, but it's amazing the stuff that's down there. I would say that I took about 5, 6, 10 pieces back with me. And there were probably millions more pieces. Titanium, fuel lines, carbon fiber bits everywhere, nuts, bolts, fittings, you name it, it was down there. It was quite amazing. And, rest in peace, the fighter pilot who died in that crash. He was a Top Gun pilot. But things happen. It's dangerous. But I did get a chance to go into Rainbow Canyon, and they didn't have any planes flying there. In fact, maybe they've stopped flying planes there for the time being. I don't know. But first time I've ever been where I didn't see any planes flying. Talk with a lot of folks at camp. That's the most fun I have at camp. It's just talking to the cavalcade of people who are all different from you during camp. Normally, it's full of Europeans. This time, no Europeans, none, zero, because they can't get here. And if they do get here, they can't go back. Now, let me just rephrase that. There were Europeans in the campground, but they were Europeans who were already here and working. A couple of guys from France I saw actually on the ascent to Wild Rose, and they were French, but one worked in San Francisco, one worked in Minneapolis. They met here and they climbed the peak and had some time together because they were already here. Okay. But no Europeans, but lots of other people. Met a guy named Greg who was a retired firefighter from the Paso Robles, California area. One of the greatest wine regions, Pinot Noir regions in the world. And he doesn't drink wine. But in his defense, he said, look, I've lived there all my life. I lived there before it was wine country. So he didn't move there because it was wine country. He lived there and wine country popped up around him. But him and his buddy were just riding around the country on their motorcycles. He's been to all 50 states on his motorcycle. He's been to all four corners of the contiguous U.S. He drove his motorcycle up the Elkhorn Highway to Alaska, believe it or not. Good stories, a good adventure. I met and spoke with Juan Ibanez. He's a forest ranger, or park ranger, okay? And just an interesting story. Again, you meet interesting people there. He was born in Philadelphia. His parents came over from Spain. But I said, what's a boy from Philadelphia doing here in Death Valley? Well, he became a ranger, and he was actually in Valley Forge National Park, which is just outside of Philadelphia. He was